everybody. I'm Lois Burke and I'm a Digital Scholarship Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you for listening to my presentation today. I'll be giving a talk based on my PhD project, which I completed in early 2019. So I'm very pleased to present this research today as I embark upon hopefully turning this work into a monograph. Today I'll talk a little bit about the multiple types of writing that British girls practiced during the 19th century. I'll use a specific manuscript case study to illustrate some of my findings about the unique style of late Victorian girls' writings, how this is linked to girls' marginalised position in relation to dominant print cultures. And finally, I'll gesture towards situating this study in broader analyses of children's writing cultures. So, what do we know about the writing cultures of girls during the late 19th century? Although we might immediately associate girls' diary keeping with the 20th century, and would be right to do so, we know that there are quite a number of published and unpublished girls' diaries dating from the 19th century, of course. Victorian adults had a special interest in reading girls' words, particularly during the second half of the century. The early 19th century Scottish girl Marjorie Fleming's diaries were published by a journalist in 1858. The Journal of Emily Shaw, written during the 1830s, was published in 1891. And Daisy Ashford's The Young Visitors, a story rather than a diary, was written in 1890 when Daisy was aged 9. And J.M. Barrie, the writer of Peter Pan, of course, provided a preface for the publication. The connection between published girl writers and rather famous or canonical 19th century male writers is something I'll perhaps come back to a bit later or in the questions. In recent decades, we've seen a growing academic interest in girls' writings from this period. Philippe Lejeune has, for example, studied girls' diaries in 19th century France. We also see republished girls' diaries or reminiscences of childhood, like Persephone's edition of Molly Hughes's A London Child of the 1870s. We also see the founding of the Juvenilia Press and the Journal of Juvenilia Studies in 2018, which has contributed to mapping the history of young Victorians' writings, chiefly canonical figures like the Brontes, George Eliot, John Ruskin, Robert Louis Stevenson, and others. Moreover, recent work on children's more collective or connected writing cultures in the form of school magazines and engagements in the periodical press are also shedding light on young people's self-made print cultures during the 19th century. And I think we're hearing from some of these figures during this conference, which is very exciting. So Christine Moruzi and Sian Pooley have written on magazine correspondence pages where young people of varying ages and from various socio-economic backgrounds interacted with other readers and had their voice heard. But I suggest we can see this type of writing was part of a wider writing culture that young people, and I argue particularly girls, inhabited at this point. So in my PhD, I looked at girls' group writings in domestic manuscript magazines, a subject and form of writing which has been fairly understudied. It is, of course, rather difficult to find children's writings in collections, and also quite a tall task to start to analyse and draw conclusions from them. So the manuscript magazines I looked at were produced by and circulated amongst a specific group of child writers who were predominantly or exclusively made up of girls. These magazines contained serial stories, poetry and drawings. Some contained riddles, competition pages, and even photographs. Some were edited by girls, and one notable example, The Barnacle, was edited by successful children's writer and magazine editor Charlotte Young. For my PhD thesis, I took case studies from several different collections in the UK, the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh, Lady Margaret Hall College Library at the University of Oxford, and the Women's Library at the London School of Economics. These manuscripts cover the final 4 decades of the 19th century. It's also a period which has been identified as the first golden age of children's literature, and also a period during which the specific needs of adolescence became quite a topic of discussion for some educationalists and medical professionals. Now, In my thesis, I was interested in teasing out the shared features of girls' manuscript magazine culture across archival collections. Can we say this is what girls chose to write about amongst themselves in the home? And I also wanted to find out how these writings fit into our other understandings of British girlhood and the shared cultures of young people in the late 19th century. I published a journal article in Victorian Periodicals Review, which examines two of the manuscript magazines that I look at. The Barnacle Manuscript Magazine, edited by Charlotte Young, who I mentioned, and the Evergreen Chain, a manuscript magazine from the 1890s, created by a group of young friends across the UK and edited by a girl based in Edinburgh. Today, I'll talk a little bit about another case study I've looked at, which hasn't been written on, but I hope will be included in my book on Victorian girls' forms of authorship. So today I'll discuss the manuscripts of Eglantine Jebb, which are held in the Women's Library. Eglantine, along with her sister Dorothy Buxton, co-founded the charity Save the Children in the aftermath of the First World War as a response to mass starvation of children in Germany and Austria. In the 1920s, she wrote the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which was later used to create the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. Eglantine experienced a privileged, creative, and fairly idyllic childhood. She was raised in Ellesmere in Shropshire in a country mansion. Her father, Arthur, was a landowner and ex-barrister who helped to found the Ellesmere Literary and Debating Society. Her mother, Ty, was an Irish-born artist and poet who founded the Home Arts and Industry Association, quite an influential arts and education charity. Eglantine's older siblings were Emily, Louisa, and Richard, and her younger siblings were Dorothy and Gamel. Now, there are many documents in the Women's Library collection concerning Eglantine's clearly very interesting working life. But there are also many manuscripts that she created during her childhood in the 1880s. I believe there's even some material from Eglantine's whole family still held in private papers. So alongside a manuscript magazine, which I will go into more detail shortly, other juvenilia includes diaries written by Eglantine and her sister Emily, or Em, fragments of jointly written stories by the two sisters, Eglantine's draft writing book, and a colourful book seen here of Eglantine's invented maps depicting countries such as Jebbyland, akin to those that the Bronte children would create. In order to know what Victorian children wrote about, it is important to have an idea of what they read. The Jebb children were engrossed in literature, and we know a number of the works that they enjoyed. Eglantine's siblings enthused retrospectively about her passion for stories, and particularly her improvised storytelling abilities. The family shared reading and writing experiences. Every week, each child wrote to their Aunt Noni, Arthur's older sister. Em would read improving text by Ruskin to the family, and their parents would read Dickens aloud to the children. Amongst themselves, the children established their own passing society where they would talk on a subject that they pulled out of a hat. It is also evident from their childhood writings that the Jebb sisters read contemporary novels which were popular with girls, including Charlotte Young's Dove in the Eagle's Nest, Juliana Ewing's 6 to 16 and Story of a Short Life, and Mrs. Molesworth's The Cuckoo Clock. Eglantine's letters are full of references to Walter Scott's novels and poems as well. So the girls clearly had an extensive knowledge of literature as well as literary society practices from their father's experiences. And this is evident in their writings. So between the ages of 12 and 15, Eglantine was the editor of her family manuscript magazine, The Briarland Recorder, which was made up of contributions written by her and her siblings. In the magazine, Eglantine lists her siblings' position in the publication. So she was the editor and secretary and also contributed under the name R. Hare. Her younger brother and sisters were also given specific roles. Gamel was given the pseudonym of Professor Stamps, sometimes A.G. Stamps, who was professor and reporter. Her young sister Dorothy, age 8 in 1889, was known as Letitia Perkins or Countess Consequence, and was listed as an honorary member. Eglantine's older sister, Emily, was 17 at the time of the first issue and was not part of the editorial team, but contributed using the pseudonym Periwinkle, like periwinkle blue, which presumably reflected her study of art in Dresden at the time. Another older sister, Louisa, used the nom de plume Polywall. So Eglantine would write and illustrate periodical stories with names such as Anna and her doll and Records of the Gate. And she would write poetry too. She was the chronicler of her family life and would write news of the family, particularly her parents and her older brother, who was away from home studying. The children's father, Arthur Jebb, held the highest position in this fantasy hierarchy. He was referred to as His Majesty. Their mother, Tai, was the Queen, and their aunt was the Dowager Lady Bunn. So the children viewed their magazine as reflective of their sort of domestic taxonomy. It was still wedded to the reality of their family life, even as it played with fantasy and creativity. Speaking of fantasy and creativity, Eglantine engaged in textual adaptation in this magazine in a very similar manner that I found in other girls' manuscript magazines of the period. A significant example of this is when Eglantine appropriates sections from the novel Little Women in her magazine. Two poems, and indeed other writings in the Bryland Recorder, have a distinctive intertext in the fictional manuscript magazine The Pickwick Portfolio, made by the March sisters in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women from 1868. Little Women tells the story of the four March siblings, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, much like the four Jebb sisters, and their experience of growing up at home during the American Civil War. They all enjoy reading, writing, and at-home theatricals. Jo writes a novel which is memorably burnt by her younger sister Amy, and they organise their own society called the Pickwick Club. Jo has her sisters adopt a male pen name to be in the club, and indeed it's a girl-only space, as Laurie notably isn't allowed to partake in the activities of the Pickwick Club. Oops. So the Pickwick Club in Little Women in turn was taken from Charles Dickens and the culture that sprung up following the publication of his first novel, The Pickwick Papers. Pickwick clubs sprung up, for example, the Pickwick Bicycle Club, which was started in 1870 and is still going today. Everyone in the club has a male pseudonym taken from Dickens's novel about the absurd club who have ridiculous adventures. I suggest that the fictional Pickwick Club and their magazine, The Pickwick Portfolio in Little Women, was a source of inspiration for a poem written by young Eglantine in the Bryland Recorder. While I have not found evidence of Eglantine reading Alcott's novel, Eglantine's poem on the anniversary of the Bryland Recorder is indebted to Alcott's creation, from its inclusion in the Poets' Corner to the rhyme scheme. In both poems, the topic is the society members with their nom de plumes and their desired longevity for the magazine. Here is the poem I transcribed from the Bryland Recorder, and then I'll share the poem from the Pickwick Club in Little Women next. For many months hath our BR much laboured for mankind, its sole aim being to improve the populace's mind, and everybody will agree its wit and use combined. Use, for it doth keep us from what we're much inclined, which is, as everybody knows, to overtax our mind with rule of three in proportion and bad things of that kind. Distinguished writers contribute to make our aims complete, and scrolls of wisdom they lay down at our feet. There's Professor A.G. Stamps, I'm sure he can't be beat. In our revered paper his wisdom it doth shine, and Polywall, slow you know, she writes a word, writes a line, stops to think and at last brings something very fine. Periwinkle doth discourse with free and ready pen, but with tears I'm forced to say it's only now and then. In the clouds doth our youngest often take high flights, from which she sometimes doth descend to give us poems of nights. For fleety flights was she renowned, but now she's turned steady and writes with gravity most great and language free and ready. Oh, prosper, prosper, good BR, and labour for mankind, and let your purpose ever be to elevate the mind. Then everybody will agree your wit and use combined. So that was Eglantine Jebs on the anniversary of BR. And this is the Pickwick portfolio in Little Women. I won't read all of it, I'll read sort of just a few stanzas. Again, we meet to celebrate with badge and solemn rite our 52nd anniversary in Pickwick Hall tonight. Now we are here in perfect health, none gone from our small band. Again, we see each other well, each well-known face, and press each friendly hand. Our Pickwick always at his post, with reverence we greet, a spectacles on nose he reads our well-filled weekly sheet. Although he suffers from a cold, we joy to hear him speak, for words of wisdom from him fall in spite of croak and squeak. Old 6-foot Snodgrass looms on high with elephantine grace, and beams upon the company with brown and jovial face. The year is gone, we still unite to joke and laugh and read, and tread the path of literature that doth to glory lead. Long may our paper prosper well, our club unbroken be, and coming years their blessings pour on the useful, gay PC. So I suggest here, Eglantine is adapting a textual example, which is itself an adaptation from Dickens, of course. It demonstrates her connectedness and close proximity to popular literature, and also demonstrates how literature was used as a springboard for girls to define their own relationship to text and their own sense of authorship. In the spirit of this conference's theme, speaking up and speaking out, I suggest that some of the sentiments expressed in Girls Collaborative and manuscript magazines work against an adult literary hegemony. I suggest what we see here is specifically, it's a specifically feminized appropriation of traditionally male spaces and roles. We see the role of editor, the androcentric editorial office, the magazine page itself, all repurposed by Eglantine here and by the March sisters in Little Women. Other scholars have seen that writing for girls in the late Victorian period was about finding identity through engaging with adult or dominant discourses. To return to my earlier question about the defining features of girls' manuscript magazines from this period, I suggest a couple of points. So a specific type of authorship is recognised amongst the group. New roles and hierarchies are created, and submissions are subject to scrutiny, competition, and also division by age brackets of contributors as they and their manuscript creations age. So acknowledging this group dynamic changes what we know about 19th century girls' writings beyond just single-authored diaries alone. The importance of age in home manuscript magazines also complements what we know about the importance of age and the flexibility of age in published children's magazines. According to an 1896 article in the Girl's Own paper, the magazine's correspondents were, quote, young girls mostly between the ages of 12 and 25. And Beth Rodgers has written how the idea of girlhood in these published magazines was a period which was ultimately ended by marriage. So that's perhaps why we see this extended period of adolescence amongst girl writers too. Another intervention is identifying these processes of adaptation and appropriation that I've just highlighted. There are some remarkable connections between my focus on these late 19th century examples and what contemporary educationalists and sociologists write about at the moment. So Anne Haas Dyson, for example, has written on children's, quote, textual toys, which can include songs, films, and rhymes. Dyson draws on Bakhtin's ideas of heteroglossia, which is popular in periodical studies as well, to explain how children bring together school texts and popular reading, and thus create something new from this sort of mass of material and voices. She writes that with this semiotic stuff, they write themselves, children, into a new social community. They remix their borrowed words and images for new cultural productions. From this cultural studies stance, children can be seen as participants in a newly globalized commercial world. Given writing tools and social companions, they selectively copy, not from a teacher-provided message, but from the shared pleasures of commercial media and other readily accessible material. And of course, some of the literary allusions or adaptations that girls make in their writings are not so easy to identify, and that is an issue that must be worked through. The Little Women adaptation in the Bryland Recorder is one of the more obvious ones for contemporary scholars to identify. So yeah, briefly, where do we go next? I'm interested in bringing this analysis into broader discussions of the development of children's literature and culture during this period, with more sort of cross comparisons with archival case studies. I want to propose that we incorporate these 19th century examples of children's writings into discussion, into wider discussions about minor self-publishing cultures. So from early 19th century chapbooks to 20th century zines and other fan cultures. I wonder if manuscript magazines is sort of one step or one phase in between these two minor print developments. Also, this is one of my more sort of wacky ideas, so I'm interested to hear if anyone has any thoughts. Can we see a cultural evolution of some of the stories that are told and adapted over time by girls or by children more broadly? We see cultural evolution being applied to folk cultures, including folk music and fairy tales. So can we apply this to children's writings and stories and adaptations? And finally, I would like to pursue digital opportunities with children's writings from the 19th century. What can we learn from these materials when we scan, digitize, make accessible these writings? And here's a really nice example that I recommend you check out. It's Girl on the Whale Ship. It's the diary of a girl on a 19th century whaling ship voyage, and it's just been beautifully presented. So what can digitization and digital projects, what benefits can they bring to analyses of the history of childhood and other aspects of literary and historical research? So yeah, this has been my brief return to my PhD research on late Victorian girls' manuscript cultures and the significance of appropriation, particularly in these works. And I will be delighted to hear any questions or comments during the Q&A session.